In the years just before 1917, most farms in North America still moved at the speed of muscle. Fields were worked by men, animals, and time-consuming routines refined over generations. Horses were the primary source of power. A typical farm needed several teams, not because all of them worked at once, but because animals required rest, feed, care, and replacement. A significant share of harvested grain never left the farm at all. It was fed back to the horses that made the harvest possible in the first place. This system had limits that were becoming impossible to ignore. A farmer could only cultivate as many acres as his teams could physically handle. Plowing was slow, usually done at shallow depth, and heavily dependent on weather and soil conditions. Wet ground exhausted animals quickly. Dry, compacted soil demanded more passes. Every additional acre required more labor, more feed, and more time. Productivity increased only marginally, and only with rising costs. The problem was not a lack of skill. By the early 20th century, farmers were highly efficient within the boundaries of animal power. Tools were well understood: moldboard plows, harrows, seed drills, binders. What they lacked was a reliable way to scale effort. When demand for food rose, driven by urbanization, industrial labor, and eventually war, farms could not easily respond. Expanding acreage meant hiring workers who were increasingly hard to find, or purchasing more animals that consumed resources year-round. Labor shortages intensified the pressure. Rural populations were shrinking as factories and cities pulled workers away from agriculture. Seasonal help became expensive or unavailable. During peak periods like planting and harvest, timing mattered more than ever, yet farms were constrained by daylight, fatigue, and biological limits. A delayed planting could reduce yields significantly, regardless of how well the rest of the year was managed. These constraints shaped every decision on the farm. Crop rotation, field size, and even the distance between barns and fields were determined by how far a horse team could reasonably travel and work in a day. The system functioned, but only within narrow margins. It was stable, not resilient. Any disruption, illness, weather, labor loss, had immediate consequences. By the mid-1910s, the question was no longer whether traditional power had limits. Farmers knew that already. The unresolved problem was simpler and more urgent. How to replace animal labor with a machine that could work longer, pull harder, and ultimately cost less to keep alive. Attempts to mechanize agriculture were not new by the time farmers began questioning animal power. Steam traction engines had been working fields since the late 19th century, and early internal combustion tractors already existed. On paper, these machines promised exactly what farmers needed: more pulling power, longer working hours, and freedom from feeding animals. In practice, they solved one problem by creating several new ones. Steam tractors were powerful but impractical for most farms. They were large, heavy, and expensive, often weighing several tons. Their weight compacted soil, reducing yields in subsequent seasons. Operating them required skill and constant attention. Water had to be hauled to the field, fuel had to be managed, and warm-up times were long. For smaller farms, the investment made little sense. Steam power worked best for large operations or contract work, not for everyday plowing and cultivation. Early gasoline and kerosene tractors appeared more promising, but they carried their own limitations. Many were essentially scaled-down stationary engines mounted on crude frames. They were unreliable, difficult to start, and required frequent maintenance. Ignition systems were sensitive, cooling was often inadequate, and fuel quality varied widely. Breakdowns during critical fieldwork were common, and spare parts were not always available locally. Cost was another barrier. Most tractors were built in small numbers by specialized manufacturers. Without mass production, prices remained high. Purchasing a tractor could equal the value of a good team of horses several times over, with no guarantee that the machine would last or perform as advertised. Financing options were limited, and many farmers were cautious after seeing neighbors struggle with experimental machinery. Design also reflected the mindset of engineers rather than farmers. Controls were awkward, visibility was poor, and machines were often adapted from industrial or road-based concepts. They worked, but not comfortably or intuitively. Farmers had to adapt their routines to the machine, rather than the machine fitting into existing farm practices. As a result, mechanization advanced slowly. Tractors existed, but they were exceptions rather than replacements. Horses remained the default because, despite their inefficiency, they were predictable. They could be repaired with feed and rest. Machines, when they failed, stopped completely. By the mid-1910s, agriculture faced a contradiction. The technology to replace animal power existed, but not in a form that farmers could afford, trust, or easily use. The system needed a different approach, one that treated the tractor not as a novelty, but as a basic tool. By 1915, the pressure on agriculture had reached a point where incremental improvements were no longer enough. Demand for grain was rising sharply, especially as Europe entered full-scale war. At the same time, rural labor continued to disappear. Farms needed more output from fewer people, and they needed it quickly. The existing balance between land, labor, and power could not stretch any further. What farmers were asking for was not more power in absolute terms. Many did not need massive engines or extreme pulling force. What they needed was consistency. A machine that could start every morning, work all day, and be operated by one person with minimal training. Just as importantly, it had to be affordable, not as a prestige investment, but as a replacement for horses. This reframed the problem entirely. Instead of asking how to build the strongest tractor, the real question became how to build enough tractors. That meant standardization, simplified design, and predictable manufacturing. It was no longer an engineering challenge alone. It was a production challenge. Henry Ford approached agriculture from this perspective. His experience was not in farm machinery, but in building automobiles at scale. The moving assembly line had already transformed car production, driving costs down and output up. Ford believed the same logic could apply to tractors. If a tractor could be designed with fewer parts, built from standardized components, and assembled in large volumes, its price could fall low enough to compete directly with animal power. This idea ran counter to prevailing assumptions. Most manufacturers believed tractors were inherently complex machines, destined for limited production. Ford rejected that. He argued that complexity was a design choice, not a requirement. If the machine was built for a single purpose, pulling farm implements, it could be stripped of everything else. The result was a concept that prioritized function over tradition. No ornate castings, no excessive adjustments, no optional configurations. One model, one engine type, one basic layout. Repairs would be simple, parts would be interchangeable. Farmers would not need to become mechanics to keep it running. By 1917, this philosophy materialized as the Fordson Model F. It was not the first tractor, and it was not the most powerful, but it was designed from the beginning to be produced by the tens of thousands. In doing so, it reframed the tractor from a specialist machine into a mass-market tool, and agriculture would have to adjust accordingly. When the Fordson Model F first appeared in fields and factory yards, it looked wrong to many farmers. Not broken or unfinished, but unfamiliar in ways that triggered distrust. Earlier tractors, especially steam engines, were long, tall, and visually heavy. Even early gasoline tractors often resembled industrial machines on wheels. The Fordson did not follow that visual language. Its most striking feature was its compactness. The engine, transmission, and rear axle were integrated into a single structural unit. There was no separate frame in the traditional sense. To engineers, this reduced weight and parts count. To farmers, it looked fragile. Machines were expected to have massive frames because strength was associated with visible bulk. The Fordson challenged that assumption directly. The driving position added to the discomfort. The operator sat high and close to the rear axle, with the engine directly in front. The front wheels were relatively light compared to the rear, which carried most of the weight for traction. On uneven ground or when pulling heavy implements, this balance could feel unsettling. Farmers used to horses sensed risk where engineers saw efficiency. Controls were simple, almost austere. There were fewer levers than on many competing tractors, fewer adjustments, and little room for customization. Ford had deliberately removed complexity, but for users accustomed to mechanical feedback and manual control, simplicity felt like limitation. If something went wrong, there was less to adjust and nowhere to compensate. Steel wheels, common at the time, made operation harsh. The tractor transmitted vibration directly through its structure. Without suspension or cushioning, long hours in the field were physically demanding. Again, this was not unique to the Fordson, but its rigid, compact design made the experience more pronounced. Most importantly, the Fordson broke visual continuity with animal power. Horses moved independently, adjusted to terrain instinctively, and gave constant feedback to the driver. The tractor did none of that. It demanded trust in machinery rather than observation of living systems. For many farmers, that shift felt premature. Yet every unusual feature served a purpose. The integrated construction reduced manufacturing cost. The weight distribution improved traction in plowing. The minimal controls reduced training time. What looked wrong was the result of deliberate choices aimed at mass adoption, not mechanical elegance. The Fordson was not trying to look like a tractor farmers recognized. It was trying to function as a tool that could be built, sold, and repaired at unprecedented scale. Acceptance would come later, not through appearance, but through results. At the core of the Fordson Model F was a design philosophy that prioritized adequacy over excess. The engine was a four-cylinder internal combustion unit, running on gasoline or kerosene, depending on configuration and operating practice. Exact output figures varied by source and testing method, but in typical field conditions, it delivered enough power to pull 2 bottom plows in average soil. That placed it well within the practical needs of small and medium farms. The engine block, transmission, and rear axle were cast together as a single unit. This approach reduced alignment issues and eliminated the need for a heavy ladder frame. Fewer parts meant fewer fasteners, fewer potential failure points, and faster assembly. It also meant that stresses were carried through the structure itself, which required careful casting but simplified overall construction. Power was transmitted through a basic gear system with a limited number of forward speeds and a single reverse. The range was narrow but sufficient. Plowing, cultivating, and hauling did not require fine speed control. They required consistency. The Fordson delivered that by keeping the drivetrain simple and robust. Cooling was handled by a straightforward thermosiphon system, relying on natural circulation rather than a water pump. This reduced mechanical complexity and maintenance, but it also meant the engine depended heavily on proper coolant levels and clean passages. In cold climates, freezing was a known risk if the system was not drained properly. Starting the engine required manual cranking. There was no electric starter. This was standard for the era, but it reinforced the need for proper technique. Incorrect timing or careless handling could cause kickback, leading to injuries. Again, this was not unique to the Fordson, but it shaped daily use. The tractor's weight, concentrated over the rear wheels, provided strong traction relative to its size. This allowed it to outperform heavier machines in certain tasks. However, The same balance contributed to a well-documented tendency to rear up under extreme load, particularly when pulling from a high hitch point. Operators had to learn new habits to manage this risk. In technical terms, the Fordson was not advanced. It lacked refinement and redundancy. But every element was chosen to meet a single requirement: doing enough work reliably at the lowest possible cost. That focus defined its impact more than any individual specification. When the Fordson Model F began reaching farms in meaningful numbers during the final years of the First World War and immediately after, it entered a world already under pressure from food shortages and labor disruption. In the United States, early users were often farmers experimenting under the promise of lower operating costs compared to horses. In Britain, especially during wartime food production drives, tractors were tested and deployed in controlled programs to increase plowed acreage. Reactions from farmers were mixed from the beginning, shaped by both the machine's potential and its unfamiliar behavior in real field conditions. Some operators quickly recognized that the tractor could maintain steady work for long hours without fatigue, something no team of horses could match. Others struggled with reliability issues, maintenance demands, and the learning curve required to operate a machine that responded differently from living animals. Breakdowns in the field were not uncommon, particularly when maintenance routines were ignored or when operating conditions became too harsh. Even so, the ability to replace multiple horse teams with a single machine began to shift economic calculations on many farms. In many cases, the initial cost of purchase was offset in theory by reduced feed expenses, since tractors did not require year-round maintenance like horses. However, those savings depended heavily on fuel availability, mechanical skill, and the farmer's ability to keep the machine operational during peak seasons. Where infrastructure and knowledge were lacking, tractors could become more expensive than the systems they were meant to replace. This created a divide between early adopters who benefited immediately and those who viewed the technology as unreliable or premature. Despite these challenges, production continued to scale as Ford applied mass manufacturing techniques that reduced unit cost over time. As more units entered the field, farmers began sharing practical knowledge, slowly improving reliability through better maintenance habits. What had started as an experimental machine was gradually becoming a standardized tool in certain regions of commercial farming. By the end of this early deployment phase, the Fordson was no longer a curiosity, but a serious, if imperfect, alternative to animal power. Once the Fordson Model F left the controlled expectations of demonstrations and entered full seasonal cycles, its real behavior in the field became unavoidable. Farming is not a laboratory environment. Soil changes by the hour, weather reshapes traction, and workloads peak in narrow, unforgiving windows. In these conditions, the tractor's strengths and weaknesses became sharply visible. On dry, firm ground, the Fordson performed its intended role efficiently. It could pull plows steadily, maintain consistent speed, and operate for long stretches without the biological limits of animal fatigue. For large acreages, this meant a level of continuity that horse teams could not sustain. Fields that once required multiple days of staggered work could be completed in shorter, more concentrated periods, allowing better timing for planting cycles. However, in soft or wet soil, the machine revealed its limits. The relatively light front end combined with heavy rear weight distribution sometimes made steering difficult under load. If traction was lost, recovery was not always simple. Unlike horses, which could adjust footing instinctively, the tractor depended entirely on wheel grip and operator judgment. In some conditions, it could become stuck more quickly than expected, requiring additional equipment or manual assistance to recover. Maintenance in real conditions also proved critical. Dust, moisture, and vibration affected early ignition systems and fuel delivery. Operators who followed strict routines, cleaning filters, checking lubrication, and managing cooling, generally experienced acceptable reliability. Those who treated the machine casually often faced frequent downtime. This created a new kind of dependency, not on animals, but on mechanical discipline. In several documented farming regions, especially in North America and parts of Europe, the Fordson was used in both large-scale grain production and smaller mixed farms. Its compact size allowed it to operate in fields that were previously considered too small for mechanization. At the same time, its relatively low cost, compared to competing tractors, made it accessible to farmers who would never have considered mechanization before. The real lesson from field use was not uniform success or failure, but adaptation. Farmers began redesigning workflows around the tractor's capabilities rather than forcing it into traditional horse-based routines. Implements were adjusted, field patterns were changed, and maintenance schedules became part of the agricultural calendar. The machine was no longer just a replacement for horses. It was becoming a structural element in how farming itself was organized. As the Fordson Model F entered large-scale production in the early 1920s, its identity shifted from an experimental farm machine to a standardized industrial product. It was no longer just a response to wartime demand, but part of a broader strategy to reshape agricultural labor through mass production. Production expanded through Ford's assembly line system, which reduced unit costs and allowed tractors to reach a far wider range of farms than earlier machines. By simplifying design and using interchangeable parts, Fordson tractors could be built in much higher numbers than most competing models of the same era. In Britain, large government-backed ploughing initiatives during and after World War I further accelerated adoption of tractors like the Fordson. At the same time, Ford's international strategy led to localized production arrangements and assembly operations in different markets. This helped reduce shipping costs and made the tractor more accessible in regions where importing heavy machinery was expensive or impractical. As more units entered service, feedback from farmers gradually influenced minor improvements in maintenance procedures and operating practices. Despite competition from other manufacturers, the Fordson maintained a strong position in the entry-level tractor market throughout the decade. Its combination of low cost, simple construction, and mass availability made it a turning point in agricultural mechanization history. However, the rapid expansion also exposed logistical and technical challenges, particularly maintenance support and parts distribution across rural areas. Farmers in remote regions often depended on local improvisation when official service networks were unavailable or delayed. This led to a growing culture of mechanical familiarity among farmers, who began repairing and modifying tractors themselves. In some regions, especially in North America and parts of Europe, Fordson tractors became a common sight in large-scale grain production. By the mid-1920s, the tractor was no longer experimental technology, but an established component of modern agricultural systems. At the same time, differences in regional manufacturing and corporate control began to shape how the Fordson evolved in different markets. While competition intensified, the Fordson's true advantage remained its alignment with mass production principles rather than specialized engineering refinement. It redefined expectations for affordable farm machinery. By the mid-1920s, the Fordson Model F had moved beyond individual farms and become part of a broader transformation in global agriculture. Its influence was no longer limited to mechanics or farm efficiency, but extended into food supply chains, rural economies, and national production strategies. The ability to mechanize large areas of land with a relatively affordable tractor changed how governments and agricultural planners thought about output and resource allocation. In regions where adoption was rapid, fewer workers were needed to cultivate the same amount of land, accelerating rural to urban migration trends already underway in the industrial age. At the same time, productivity gains were not evenly distributed, as access to tractors depended heavily on capital, infrastructure, and proximity to emerging industrial suppliers. This created a divide between mechanized commercial farms and smaller operations that continued relying on animal power for longer periods. The Fordson's mass production model intensified competition among manufacturers, forcing other companies to reconsider pricing, durability, and simplicity in their own designs. As tractors became more common, they also influenced crop planning, enabling larger fields and more standardized agricultural practices across different countries. Financial systems adapted as well, with banks beginning to offer credit structures specifically tailored to mechanized farming investments. The Fordson thus became not just a machine, but a driver of systemic change in how food was produced and distributed globally. Mechanization also changed the relationship between farmers and time, as seasonal work could be completed faster and with greater predictability than before. In some areas, this allowed farms to expand their cultivated acreage without proportional increases in labor. However, it also increased dependence on fuel supply chains and mechanical maintenance networks that were not always reliable in rural regions. Over time, this shift contributed to the consolidation of smaller farms into larger, more capital-intensive operations. The Fordson's impact was therefore not only technological, but also structural, reshaping how agricultural economies were organized at scale. This transition marked an early step toward the modern industrialized food systems that would define much of the 20th century. Even after production methods evolved and newer tractor models appeared, the Fordson remained a reference point for low-cost mechanization. Returning to the fields where the Fordson Model F first began to replace horse teams, the change becomes visible not as a single event, but as a layered transformation built over years. Where once multiple animals moved slowly across narrow strips of land, a single tractor now pulls wider implements across larger, more continuous fields. The rhythm of agriculture has shifted from biological cycles to mechanical scheduling, where fuel availability and machine readiness matter more than animal endurance. On many farms, the old infrastructure has been gradually reorganized around the tractor. Barns that once stored feed for horses now store fuel and spare parts. Maintenance routines have replaced feeding schedules. The presence of the Fordson has quietly altered not only field work, but the entire logistical system supporting it. Even farm labor itself has changed, with fewer workers required for the same acreage, but with higher expectations for mechanical understanding and repair capability. Looking back at the early doubts surrounding the machine's appearance and handling, those concerns now appear as part of a transitional phase rather than final judgment. The Fordson was never designed to imitate horses or refine traditional tractor aesthetics. It was designed to remove dependence on animal power entirely, even if that meant discomfort, adjustment, and operational trade-offs in the short term. Over time, farmers adapted their expectations to match what the machine could reliably deliver. In broader perspective, the Fordson Model F represents a shift in how agricultural systems respond to constraint. Faced with limited labor and increasing demand, the solution was not simply stronger tools, but scalable tools, machines that could be produced, distributed, and maintained at a national and global level. That principle, more than any specific mechanical feature, defines its historical role. Today, even as newer tractors with greater comfort, power, and precision have replaced early models, the Fordson remains a reference point in agricultural history. It marks the moment when farming began its transition from animal-supported labor to fully mechanized production systems. The fields are the same, but the logic that governs them is no longer biological. It is industrial, and it began here.